The second session, session 2, the title of session 2 is Territorial Issue and Maritime Delimitation in Northeast Asia in Comparative Perspective. Obviously, this session is more concerned with the legal issues, I guess. Our panelists here are dominantly lawyers. But law and history, as you may already noticed, are pretty closely interrelated in East Asian regions. So we have chance to hear how historical issues in East Asia are interrelated with international legal issues such as maritime delimitation and territorial issue. I like to, panelists will have about 10 to 15 minutes each for presentation. So I'd like to invite the first speaker, Professor Charles Norkey of University of Maine. Professor Norkey, please.
Thank you, Judge and Professor Pike. Pike, thank you very much. Thank you for that. I'd also like to thank the dedicated workers in the office of the Korea Chair here for their work, and also the Northeast History Foundation in particular, President Jae Jung-chung, and also Dr. Hyung-won Kim of the foundation. I'd also like to thank Professor Seok-woo Lee of Inha University, one of my co-panelists, for the invitation to be here and to join you today. Now for a touch of irony. I'm not new to Asia. I work extensively in Asia, but until recently this has tended to be Central Asia, including many landlocked countries. And much of that work, although it has involved conflicting boundary claims and delimitations, these were the kinds of artifacts called lines often across Asia. Boundaries such as the Durand Line, which is the colonial agreement purporting to be the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, and the McMahon Line, which, of course, many of you know about, another colonial instrument purporting to settle the Sino-Indian border. But the experiences from that part of the world, where clashes of history and the weight of contemporary events have been spawned in the reinterpretation of border agreements, may have some comparative relevance for Northeast Asia. And I don't see David Kang in the room, but from his presentation this morning, those of you fortunate enough to hear it, he had many trenchant observations on the colonial weight of lines, borders, and frontiers and how these continue today. And a lot of this history that we don't often as lawyers think about, but we need to think about it more, has implications for Korean and Japanese claims in the region, and also in particular to the island of Dokdo. And I'd like to say a few words about Dokdo. About a year ago, in my capacity as director of our Marine Law Institute in the University of Maine School of Law, I organized a symposium on the coast of Maine, and it was to observe a very important International Court of Justice case. It was the 25th anniversary of the Gulf of Maine case, the United States versus Canada, which delimited the Gulf of Maine region. And Dr. Hyung-won Kim, who's here, thank you, of the foundation, learned about this, sent me a message indicating that he would like to come and participate. And I was only too eager to welcome this guest from Korea to Maine, and it was through this relationship a year ago that I first began to learn about Dokdo and how intense the claims continue to be to this day. And owing in large measure to your visit, my law students just this past week in my Oceans Law class completed a moot court, which I can recommend to those of you who are students in the room, playing the roles of both Korea and Japan, in which claims to either Dokdo or, from the Japanese side, Takshimi, were hypothetically submitted to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. My only mistake was I did not invite Judge Jun-Hyung Park to come and sit. So next year, perhaps he can come and sit as sole arbitrator. But the exercise was gratifying, and I realized what a great way this is to get a new generation to begin thinking about creative ideas that our generation maybe hasn't yet come upon, both for Ducto and perhaps other Northeast Asian disputes. Well, I urge you, all of you, to carefully consider and read the paper presented for this, prepared for this meeting, not by me, but by my co-panelist, Professor Shakru Lee, because he reviews the many approaches that have been taken to resolving the Ducto disputes, and he does a cost-benefit analysis of the pros and cons. And I recommend this paper wholeheartedly. But as with any dispute implicating sovereign and maritime claims, this one has to be taken in the broader context of the public order of the oceans. States and many other actors assert multiple claims to the seas that bear on the ocean's jurisdictions of all states, including coastal states primarily. The reality, though, is that a delimitation, a maritime delimitation, emerges from a process of diverse claims that precede any state participation in a formal adjudicative arena. Now, that process of claims unfolds in both formal and in informal settings, as is true, of course, for the Ducto claims. Now, a claim is made whenever an event demands the attention of a decision maker. A claim demands attention and activates a response, and perhaps will create a policy. So reflect on that as you listen to the presentation by my co-panelist, Katrin Katz, with relation to her NSC experience with Ducto. To fully appraise a claim in our decentralized global system of power and law, a policy scientist known as Harold Laswell once urged us to ask, who says what, in which channel, to whom, and with what effect? This has to inform our ongoing analysis of the Ducto matter, a set of questions that I'm sure was running through Katrin's mind in the National Security Council when she explains her experiences to us there in a few minutes. Now, while the International Court of Justice and the Tribunal for the Law of the Sea are critical for potentially resolving maritime claims, tribunal proceedings are but one phase in the assertion of state competence over the authority and control of ocean zones and territory. That's clear. The optimal outcome is a maritime boundary, one that stabilizes expectations between states and that carries the expectation of authority of the world community. Thus, every delimitation is a culmination of a process which implicates power, wealth, well-being of coastal states, and which, as parties to maritime disputes, states draw upon a range of distinct base values to secure their objectives. Among these are derived from control over population, land, of course, marine resources, and, as we're learning today, a theme of this meeting, through the use of history and its interpretation, control, and reinterpretation. Getting back to the case involving the United States and Canada for a moment, the case concerning delimitation of the maritime boundary in the Gulf of Maine area. Anyone who is interested, we have a copy of the symposium proceedings with some very trenchant articles, including by some members here in this room, available, and it's on one of the tables. And if there aren't enough, let me know, and I'll happily supply copies. Well, this case, it fixed the maritime boundary in a 90,000 square mile kilometer known as the Gulf of Maine. Now, Canada and the United States recognize a common interest in submitting the dispute to the International Court of Justice. But equally, and almost as significantly in the long term, on both sides of the border, there has been a continuing post-judgment clarification and a recognition of common interests across a wide range of issues in the Gulf of Maine area. Now, it's not managed perfectly, but it is managed. So, almost as importantly as the line that was drawn in the sea has been the post-outcome management of the delimitation. Thus, boundary problems are interdisciplinary, and a delimitation is not a destination. It is a continuing journey. and there may be something for that in resolving claims over ducto. I'd like to again underscore something very important that historians understand and which lawyers often overlook, and that is myth. Myth as shaped by history and shared by succeeding generations. Myths settle in the collective memory of a community. They become the living bonds of generations, the depository of traditions. The collective memory defines the ways in which a society is likely to respond to subsequent events. The many myths of ducto, so susceptible to strategic manipulation by elites, are powerful, and they limit any possibility of resort to binding international adjudication. Now, however, serious trend analysis would suggest that Korea's claim to sovereignty over the islands is superior to Japan's. That's based on historical evidence. However, analysis must necessarily incorporate the relevant jurisprudence from key international law cases. Now, this has been done by my friend, colleague, and in so many ways teacher, Professor John Van Dyke, including in a 2007 article in the Journal of Ocean Development and International Law. It was entitled Legal Issues Related to Sovereignty over Ducto and its Maritime Boundary, and I highly recommend it. Now, more recently, in this volume, which appeared yesterday, Oceans and Coastal Law Journal, John explains the relevance of a very recent and a very important decision, the 2009 case concerning the delimitation in the Black Sea, Romania versus Ukraine. What is its relevance to ducto? Especially pertaining to UN Convention Law of the Sea, Article 121.3, which has to do with rocks which cannot sustain human habitation nor economic life of their own. John notes that tribunals have repeatedly ignored or slighted islands and maritime delimitations, even ones that have substantial populations residing on them. Now, John, I'm not going to preempt you and tell them what else you said in the article, and I won't tell them what you concluded about drawing the boundary in the East Sea with respect to ducto. But the fundamental question is, how might claims over ducto be resolved in the greater common interest? What are the appropriate strategies for achieving preferred outcomes? What are the implications for international jurisprudence as it stands for claims of authority and control over this island of ducto? Now, the goal that should guide any outcome is the protection of the shared oceans and its resources for the future generations. Our task is to appraise claims to ducto against policy preferences in the common interest and the range of available legal mechanisms to intervene in the social process to achieve these preferred goals. Now, this would prudently include preparation for international adjudication, even if that strategy is not pursued. However, it is important to note that Asian countries have been reluctant to submit disputes to international tribunals and to binding arbitration. The preferred strategy has been negotiation. And perhaps international adjudication will not be the appropriate strategy for resolving this dispute. Now, Western lawyers love to emphasize litigation strategies. We're always preparing for a trial because we believe that preparation for trial is the best course to settlement. However, ducto is more susceptible to resolution via an Eastern approach. Creative ideas that draw on mediation and conciliation mechanisms available by virtue of customary and conventional international law are likely the preferred strategies. And this would reflect the spirit of the remarks this morning by President Jae Chung of the Northeast History Foundation when he discussed conciliation and cooperation among East Asian nations. Indeed, regional cooperation may be the best hope for the preservation of coastal state rights and marine resources in the East Asia Sea. And so, solving the problem of ducto may require an Eastphalian journey to a Westphalian outcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Professor Norquist of University of Virginia Center for Ocean Law and Policy. Myron?
Almost forgot the New Testament here. Thank you very much, Judge Pike, and my thanks also go to the sponsors and actually for all of you that have taken time out of your busy schedules to come and listen. This is a very unusual meeting for me in the sense that I usually go to meetings that have all these lawyers present talking about law, and it's usually a very narrow focus. And here, this is the first international forum. We're at an organization that emphasizes strategic thinking, and there are many eminent and respected historians, which causes me to say, I've written a paper, you all have it. I could probably profit by giving you all 5 minutes to read it and then sit down. But I thought instead what I would do is inflict upon you a little bit about the history of the Law of the Sikh conference and what led to this document that has 320 articles and 9 annexes and already at least 2 implementing agreements that sets the rules that govern in over 70% of the Earth's surface, namely the world's oceans. So you may be wonderful historians, but you have probably never had a history about the evolution that I'm about to say inflicted upon you. I am looking forward to what I'm going to say now because I haven't decided yet. But when I start to see people nodding off, then I know I've got to speed it up or stop. Our first panel was made of Grotius, and there was indeed a debate early on in the 16th century over whether the oceans were a common area or whether they should be a closed area. Believe it or not, historians, we've come back to where that is kind of the issue, that the mega issue that's before us today. But the outcome of that debate back then was a victory for freedom of the seas. And so for 350 years approximately, the governing doctrine for the world's oceans, beyond a very narrow strip, was the freedom of the seas, which was largely enforced by the British Admiralty, again, which was mentioned earlier in our first panel. And there was a lot of doctrine that evolved. There are a huge number of cases. But it was backed up by the world's preeminent navy. This is the regime that prevailed. It was flawed in many ways, as we know now. The theory was that the supply of fish, for example, was inexhaustible, so that anyone that caught one reduced it to possession, and they didn't worry about if the next group couldn't catch them. We now know that we have oceans in a very deplorable state of conditions on fishing. So that theory was flawed. We now have a different set of competing concerns. Freedom of the seas really started to be challenged, as it often, these changes often come from the United States. The Truman Proclamation, well, there were 2 proclamations, one on continental shelf and one on fisheries in 1945, had evolved after the Second World War because the swamplands off the Mississippi Delta. If you look at where the Mississippi Delta goes out there, it dumps all kinds of sediments over the centuries, and it's very good for sedimentary basins, or where you find offshore petroleum. And so we had started in our country developing the technology when oil was hard to get to go into first the swamplands and then offshore. So it became evident that we had the ability technologically to develop oil offshore. Well, we also know that some of that freedom, as evidenced by the recent problems in the Gulf of Mexico, it can have a lot of environmental consequences. So the law was that freedom of the seas, except that we had this idea of the continental shelf coming in. After the war, we also stood up several institutions. One of them was the United Nations, and it had an international law commission. And one of the first items that it put on its agenda was to look at the law of the sea. And there had been some preparatory work at 1930s at Harvard and some other places, but there had never been a codification of the law of the sea, which is kind of interesting because in public international law, which is by definition the relations between states, the oceans generated more interaction between states than any other activity in the universe. So we had lots of customary practices that had developed. If two ships are approaching each other in an area on a course, you don't want one going starboard and the other going port because they'll still run into each other. So they develop rules out of necessity. And some of them are commercial rules. Someone mentioned the Greeks. The Greeks in 1700 BC in the Mediterranean had already developed rules about sharing risk. So if someone was sending olive oil over to Italy from Greece, and they had 10 ships of it, and one of the ships went down, then the other 9 ships would chip in and keep that grower viable. So practical rules evolved. Well, at the International Law Commission, they evolved the rules that ultimately were embodied in 4 conventions. This was when the first conference on the law of the sea was held in 1958, and they used the ILC drafts. There was a second conference held in 1970 because 2 issues, namely the extent of fisheries jurisdiction and the breadth of the territorial sea, which are lines in the oceans issues, of course, had not been resolved. And they had a second meeting, and it just didn't work out. So we then had a period between 1960 and 1965. And then kind of like 3 events came together in about 1966. One was that a fellow by the name of John Murrow at Scripps Institute of Oceanography published a widely understood paper that talked about all the resources that were on the deep seabed, namely these manganese nodules. And that excited quite a few people. We also had a very inspirational, broad-gauged ambassador to the United Nations named Arvid Pardo, who went on to make he tied up the General Assembly for 2 days speaking on how the world needed to help right the differences between the rich and the poor by having a conference where the resources beyond national jurisdiction would be part of the common heritage of mankind. And then we also had a third development that wasn't as well publicized, but I think interesting to historians, when you analyze interests. The United States and the Soviet Union at that time both wanted to keep track of each other in the oceans. They were both major maritime powers, and they were both very concerned about the fact that in the 50s, the countries of Ecuador, Peru, and Chile had declared 200-mile territorial seas. And one of the characteristics of a territorial sea is that if you're in a territorial sea that you recognize, you're supposed to come to the surface if you're a submarine. The doctrine evolved before there were submarines. And the coastal states have also the right to control aircraft that overfly. Well, you can see when 200-mile zones cover about 25% of the surface of the Earth that this was a major problem for maritime powers. So we divvied up the world, and we sent delegations around to try to talk to our friends, saying how important it was to have a balance in the world's oceans. And the Soviets did the same. As I say, these factors came together, and the long and short is that the United Nations decided that it would set up first an ad hoc committee to look at these new resources, and then in December of 1970 passed something called the Principles Resolution. And I guess here I can say I'm pretty confident I'm the only one in the room that was on the floor of the General Assembly at the time this vote was taken in 1970. So I was there, and I remember there was a lot of debate about whether the U.S. would accept the resolution. And I remember very vividly the chair of our delegation, who was a legal advisor at the Department of State, saying, well, common heritage will be defined in the subsequent treaty. So the long and short of this is that we had several preparatory meetings where, believe me, the first two were almost exclusively devoted to what's this conference going to deal with. And at the end of the day, it was decided that it would deal with everything, that it would be a comprehensive convention. And so in 1973, they sort of kept with their deadline by having an organizational session, because the conference was scheduled to begin in 1973. They had a 2-week organizational session. And we kicked off the conference. And then the first substantive meeting really took place in Caracas, Venezuela. And that meeting was the first time that about 150 countries had ever laid out their government's positions on the law of the sea. There were some other interesting elements that were going on that, again, not talked about a lot. But one was that the Russians had lost a submarine, or the Soviet Union had lost a nuclear submarine with nuclear warheads on it. And we had been keeping better track of their submarines than they had. We knew where it was, and they didn't. They didn't think we knew where it was. And so one of the things that was going on at the Law of the Sea Conference was that we had, our government had commissioned through the CIA to hire Lockheed and Global Marine Development Corporation to use the cover of being a deep seabed mining operation to go out and raise this in about 20,000 feet of water. And so one of the things that was going on is that we did not really pour damp water on what the great riches that were supposed to be beyond national jurisdiction. But I can assure you that International Nickel, Frank LeQuay by name, for example, would come to the UN and say, this is a pipe dream. You know, there isn't going to be any development of the nickel, copper, cobalt, and so on for at least 50 years. And nobody, you talk about myth, nobody wanted to hear that. So the long and short of this, again, is that we, on the issue that I wrote about, which is the islands provision, a single provision, at the meeting in Caracas, all the proposals were put forward, and they had to organize it some way. So they put out what is called a main trends paper that supposedly reflected the views of everybody. And I might say at that time, China was very, oh, this is unkind maybe, unsophisticated. They just made general statements. They did not really perceive their interests, and so they, at that time, of course, Taiwan was representing China in the UN, and so there isn't much in the way of decent legislative history about China. Japan was very sophisticated, but very slow to act. I've traced the legislative history on this regime of islands, and in my paper I do just cite it. It's simple enough, and so for the last part of this presentation, I'm simply going to say that there's a separate part that is for the regime of islands. And the first paragraph says that an island is a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water which is above water at high tide. And I think the significant thing there is the word naturally formed. That I think will be a controversial issue. The second one is really quite a shocking paragraph. It says, except it is provided in paragraph 3, which I'll get to in a second. The territorial sea, the contiguous zone, the exclusive economic zone, and the continental shelf of an island are determined in accordance with this convention as applicable to land territory. So an island, if it's an island, gets a 200-mile zone around it. Now, if you have, let's take one that's close to home, as it were, Johnston Island. If you arc a 200-mile zone around that, the resource area is larger than the state of California. So I find that rather shocking. I find it actually very inequitable. But that's what the convention says. That's what the law says. And so we're certainly stuck with that for a long time. And that was debated extensively at the conference. And those that were trying to expand coastal state claims prevailed. Then comes 121.3, which is the heart of the Dokdo problem. Rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or economic life of their own shall have no exclusive economic zone or continental shelf. So the first question would be, is Dokdo a rock or is it an island? And you cannot find the answer in history. As I do, you can employ certain treaty interpretation principles and come to some conclusions. But in the 10 minutes I have, I'm not going to inflict that upon you. So with that, I'll conclude and thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Professor Isogu of Inha University of Korea.
Sorry. Sorry, I getting old. I have a little bit trouble to see correctly. I want to first thank you to host. Unfortunately, they are unattended right now for inviting me for this conference. What I talked to in my presentation is, reflecting the key word in the previous sessions. For example, the legacy or the history of sovereignty, I want to point out the couple of the basic issues when you approach the territorial dispute in East Asia, and with more time to specialize the issues of Dokdo, which is the highly key issues in that area. This is the map, show the area which is quite familiar to you. And as the professor, the Marunokis mentioned, based on the Article 1, Article 121.3, if there is a dotting island in the ocean, if that island or the rocks, the entire to generate 200 nautical miles, it has the same size of the state California, as he mentioned there. And the biggest challenges in this description is that if there is oil, or if there is natural resources, or there is the fisheries resources, it causes a lot of trouble for the area, because that causes the stake for the interstate. And this is Dokdo. And this is Dokdo. I take a photo on the helicopter by myself. I've been there a couple of times, but I don't want to go there again, because it needs a lot of the energy and the time, because it's a little bit remote. As Professor the Nokis asked us that, what is the legal status of the Dokdo? Is it rock or is it island? And I believe that if you find time to go there, you realize that easily whether it is suitable for island or rock for the entitlement of the exclusive economic zone. Before I'm talking to specifically the territorial issues in East Asia, and also in particular in the Dokdo, I want to point out why the Koreans is so emotional whenever Japan is touched upon the issue, and why there's so many civic groups have their own institution. It's in Korea, Dokdo issues a big business. There are so many the civic groups in there, and also I believe that in the state. Why they have to go in their way, I personally believe you have to understand what is general understanding of the Korean people on that small dotting island. So this is a special message by the late former President Nomuyon on Korea and Japan's relations. I choose this one because I think this is much better than what President Lee Myung-bak said recently. And this speech is actually done in the 2006 when Japan sent their the vessels in the area of the Dokdo located, and it caused the skirmishes between two countries. And at the time, the President Nomuyon laid down this speech and provide what is the general understanding of the Korean people on Dokdo issues. It is not only part of our territory, but also our own sort of historic significance, where 40 years painful history is engraved vividly. And for Koreans, Dokdo is a symbol of complete recovery of sovereignty. Dokdo is a touchstone of Japan's recognition of its past history, as well as its determination for Korean-Japan relations of future and peace in East Asia. As you see that the title of this conference today is Peace and Prosperity in Northeast Asia. So which means that without solving, without touching upon the Dokdo issues, I don't think it is quite easy and quite reasonable for Korean people to approach in their way. And the Dokdo for us is not merely a matter pertaining to territorial rights of a tiny island, but is emblematic of bringing closure to an unjust history in our relationship with Japan and of the full consolidation of Korean sovereignty. So final word, what he says is that, this is a matter where no compromise or surrender is possible, whatever the cost and sacrifice may be. after he made this speech, I think his popularity is the game more than 10% at the time. So the very nature of the territorial dispute of Dokdo in Korea is, if you think about the various cases, because distinguished guest speakers of today's this session is the basically law of the sea, specializing law of the sea and the territorial boundary issues. If you refer to the various cases of the international judicial bodies, for example, International Court of Justice, there are many cases decided by the recently. And those cases, within the last 10 years, there are so many cases decided by the court, and that they provide their jurisprudence on territorial and boundary issues. But if you look at that, those cases very closely with the fact, they're looking at the factual aspects and the legal argument of cases. The very nature of territorial disputes decided by the court is sharply different with what it's talking about territorial dispute in East Asia, because an area we're talking about today is highly reflected by the legacy of the colonialism. So I'm going to briefly talk about this one and go into how we approach, how we resolve this territorial dispute. We have to think about not only the legacy of Japanese colonialism, but we have to also think about the legacy of US security interests in that area. In international law, I believe that it is quite questionable until recently whether victorious power can exercise the dispositive power of the territory of defeated nation. So in the case of the Dokdo, and in the cases of Senkaku Diayutai or Kuril Island, whether a lot of power, in particular the United States, can exercise unlimited dispositive power over the territory of Japan, it is quite questionable, and I think it is very debatable. I showed you the copy of the document which I found the U.S. National Archives in Maryland, and this showed that how territorial arrangement or territorial disposition made by the United States in that area, they influenced by the security interests of the United States. I have a little trouble with eyes, so. The territorial settlement, this is one of the documents which are found in the National Archive when they make a draft of the territorial clause of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. As you may remember, as you may be familiar with the territorial clause of San Francisco Peace Treaty, Article 2 of that Peace Treaty is about territorial disposition of the Japan. And what they say is that when they made the territorial disposition, the United States stressed the proper psychological approach to the Japanese. Since this is the first conference, I choose the very mild one. The other one is the reference was made the same one, the suggestion of the Professor Lai Shao of Harvard, which is not yet been incorporated, but finally incorporated, and strengthens the proper psychological approach to the Japanese. At the time, it's one of the drafted, the Article 6, it's finally Article 2 of the San Francisco Peace Treaty say, security consideration must be conceivably envisage weather and radar stations thereon. As William Seaboard, then the political advisor of Japan by the State Department of the United States. This is one of the memorandums sent by the political advisor of Japan to the State Department on the issues of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And that they say, again, careful attention to the psychology and the particularity of the Japanese people. I don't know exactly what this means, but this is what document to say. Careful attention to the psychology and the particularity of the Japanese people, and attentive cognizance of the Pakistan political complexities, have to be counted on when they exercise the dispositive power over the territory. And the document to say, I fear it is important too that we bear in mind the crucial fact that we are dealing with Orientals. I think these Orientals, including myself, with whom the proper psychological approach and the manner of procedure are of cardinal importance. And the bunch of the document which found from the National Archives say, again, the security interest and the security consideration is very important when they made the territorial disposition of the Japan after war. Yeah, this is another one. The drafting of the treaty should be done consciously in order to have a certain bargaining position. What I want to intend to say is that it is in the international law, I think, as I mentioned, that it is quite debatable and quite questionable. The victorious power can exercise the dispositive power of the territory of the deputy nation. Of course, historically, if you look at the trend of the international relations, usually international, victorious power exercise unlimited the dispositive power of the territory. And in the case of the East Asia, it is quite interesting to know that at the time, as you guess, the political situation quite tricky because Cold War just began and Korea War is broken out. So the top priority for the State Department is to conclude peace treaty with Japan as early as possible. So they decided to go to shorten the version of the draft, which John Postdoles suggested at the time, and that they left the question of the sovereignty issues of the certain island. So to remain those issues still, we can see that the contemporary times. This kinds of the decision made by the state at the time, do you think is quite the politically correct or legally correct? Which I strongly believe that it's to go beyond the terms of reference, which State Departments have to follow. And I'm going to talk about this one later at the final stage to conclude my paper. And the second part is a determination of a question of sovereignty of the disputed island in East Asia. Due to the time constraint, I have to decide which island I should go to, which country within 30 seconds. In international, it is quite simple. The state have to show the evidence, which you say the probative value evidence, which state and government, they exercise the function of the disputed area by peaceful, continuous, actual, and sufficient manner. It is a highly subjective term, but you are very familiar with the historical background of the Asia. And if you apply to your own rule, you may understand that the sovereignty issues of those disputed area. And you can see that the couple of the area which is marked by the disputed area. I skipped this one, but this is actually the attached to the one of the documents of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, and they mark by fence to show that, which clearly show where the currently disputed island should go. But this idea was rejected by the State Department because the fence of the Japan will cause some disadvantage to the psychology of the Japan at the time. So they do not lay down clearly, the destiny of the disputed island so far. So it caused the current issues of the territorial dispute in that area. We can decide that if we refer the case to the ICJ, hopefully the ITLOS. But as you know, the ITLOS do not have the jurisdiction of the sovereignty issues, only have the maritime delimitation issues. And hopefully, in the future, maybe the claimants of those islands decide to refer this one to international judicial bodies or arbitration. You can decide that the sovereignty issues. But decide the sovereignty issues on the one hand, but the other hand, how we implement this one is a totally different issues. In Asia, we don't have, I mean, in terms of the East Asia, China, Japan, and Korea, we don't have any the public international legal issues so far. There are many cases of I think they have experience to the trade issues, but we don't have, as far as I remember correctly, we don't have any the public international legal issues among the countries in that area. I don't know why. As the Professor Perry they mentioned that I cannot find the reasons, but they tend to avoid to refer this one to international judicial bodies, because I'm not saying that I have always a little bit skepticism of the international judicial bodies, but if you look at it very closely of the recent cases decided by the court, they do not see the very nature of the dispute itself. What they do is that try to find what is a probative value of evidence to decide cases, which is very negative effect to the country who suffer from the colonial era, because they do not prepare and they do not equip the certain document to show this territory or this island belong to us in the past and in our history. But there is recently there is approaches how to resolve the doctor issues that come up, because annual basis we have some difficulties with the neighboring countries. I think from the perspective of state or government, it's not an easy thing to manage every time. And a couple of the approaches they provide by very renowned scholars and the practitioners in that area. And I divide by 4 categories. But honestly speaking, I think these 4 categories are interrelated to each other. So the first one is the practical approach, which includes the separation of the sovereignty issue from the allocation of maritime zone and other salient issues. The one is approach which look to the Japanese other territorial dispute involving the Kuril Island and Senkaku Island to address the doctor issue. And the third one is approach which emphasizes the U.S. role for resolving doctor issue. And finally, the approach which stresses the historical background of Japan's colonialism of Korea and its linkage with the doctor issue. First, let me briefly talk about this one. As I mentioned at the end, based on the UNCLOS of the Article 121.3 and Article 121, the doctor can generate a Territory C. And as you see that this area, as maritime delimitation is not fixed yet. But assuming that based on what Japan claimed and what Korea claimed, if you draw the median line, which is basically a quite routine one, that makes the location of a doctor into the Korean side, but give the more area to Japan, and they just forget about the exclusive economic zone. They just apply the zero impact to the doctor. And that is, I think, based on my understanding of the law of the sea and the maritime delimitation, is quite the reasonable approach when you're talking about this one. And talking about the other approach is the Kuril Island and Senkaku Island. In a historical fact to show that when United States they deal with the Okinawa Revision Treaty of 1972, and that they mentioned that about the Kuril Island. The territorial dispute in East Asia, the 3 island disputes in which Japan is engaged as disputants, are highly interrelated to each other. For example, they are all the topics of the San Francisco Peace Treaty and the decision-making process at the time to show how the United States to approach those issues. And to go beyond that, since the fact that Japan is, they engage with all the 3 island dispute as a claimant, one argument raised by the Japan for example, one cases maybe has a significant implication in the other cases. To look at the 3 island disputes, maybe find a way how we resolve the doctor issues in another example. And always the East Asia looking for the suggestion or the intervention of the United States for resolving doctor issues. And I'm not quite sure this is true or not, but in the luncheon meetings, we have so many speculation about the couple of issues involving in that area. But when the 2006, the skirmishes happened over the doctor area, at the time there is a lot of speculation, the very strong speculation the United States involved to lessen down the tensions between two countries. So this will be maybe one of the examples until today. Since as I show you that the territorial disposition made by the United States still lay down to provide some legacy of the uncertainty of the territorial disposition at the time, maybe United States should be involved more on that issues. And finally, to stress the historical background of Japanese colonialism of Korea and its linkage with the doctor issues. And as I told you, the Korean believed that doctor is, first, the territory was annexed by Japan, and without linking to the historical background, I don't think it is quite sensible for Korean people to agree any such movement. So what I'm going to say is that the very nature of territorial disputes of the doctor, I think the two islands in that area also the same category I can put. The colonialism still a serious issue. In the previous sessions, I heard that sometimes it is time to forget what was done in the before. I fully understand that that kinds of remarks, but unfortunately, some memory is growing. They're getting growing, and they give us the more clear view, since the wound is not healed clearly, and that the countries where they suffered from the colonial era, and that the issues is highly related to that issue. I don't think without touching upon the history issues, we can go directly apply to legal rules, because international judicial prudence, which I mentioned to you, based on the current judgment of the courts, I think is also highly related with what we have to think about the historical background of the cases. I believe that if that is the negotiated, and if that is the talks between the certain countries, I think we find a way that based on the current understanding of international law and territorial and boundary issues. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next speaker is Katrin Katz. She will speak about the insider's account of diplomatic crisis over this island 2 years ago.
Thank you. I was honored and excited to be asked to participate in this conference among some of the world's leading experts on history issues in Northeast Asia. And I wanted to, of course, thank the Northeast Asian History Foundation and CSIS for inviting me here today. From my time working on these issues, I know how critical they are to understanding regional dynamics. In a policy setting, they have the capacity to bring work on other more current issues to a screeching halt. My general impression is that in East Asia, these really aren't only historical issues. They are still very much a living part of regional dynamics today, constantly lurking in the background in shaping perceptions and setting boundaries in regional interactions. At times they seem dormant, but like a raw nerve, they retain the capacity to violently reemerge at a moment's notice, jolting from the back to the front burner for policymakers, who are then forced to awkwardly juggle the past and present in a delicate and sometimes clumsy tap dance. While the perfect policy response to these issues remains elusive, they cannot be ignored. and reaching a deeper understanding of them from as many perspectives as possible is not only worthwhile, but an essential pursuit for academics and policymakers alike. I hope to add to the discussion today by sharing some of my experiences working in the policy arena on one of the most sensitive of Northeast Asian history issues, as we've all been speaking about today, the Dokdo Takashima, i.e. Liancourt Rocks, sovereignty dispute between Korea and Japan. I will do so by sharing an anecdote from my time in Washington. I worked for a number of years in DC on East Asia policy issues, culminating in 1 year serving on the staff of the National Security Council from 2007 to 2008. As many of you know, during the summer of 2008, July to be exact, Washington was thrust into the middle of the most recent flare-up of the Dokdo Takashima dispute. Today I will recount my experiences dealing with the dispute. Before I begin, though, a few caveats. I was an official at the time this episode played out, but what I will discuss today in no way reflects an official account of the events of July 2008. My account consists of my own recollections as well as those of others involved in the episode, whose perspectives I gathered in a series of informal interviews this past July and August. None of us had access to official archives from 2008, and so we were all speaking basically from memory. A few things to keep in mind as I walk through the timeline of events. First, the extent to which, when dealing with thorny history issues like the Liancourt Rock sovereignty dispute, perfect policy solutions, while admirable to strive for, rarely exist in reality. Most often, the feasible policy options under consideration all have warts of some kind or other. And second, the extent to which seemingly insignificant acts can have significant consequences in the realm of international affairs. It is often more tempting to believe conspiracy theories as an explanation for what really happened than the plain old boring truth, which provides a good lead-in to my story. Today I will present an account of what really happened behind the curtain of US government operations during the July 2008 chapter of the Dokdo Takashima dispute. Admittedly, it is not the most thrilling account. I hope you all had an adequate intake of caffeine at lunch. But within the bounds of my memory and those of other officials with whom I spoke, it is a truthful account, the plain old boring truth. It would be more exciting for you and me, and perhaps more newsworthy, if I were here to reveal a juicy tale of an elaborate scheme concocted by the White House to tinker with the regional power balance in Northeast Asia, revealing once and for all the true bias of Washington on this issue. As you'll see, that was not the case. On the contrary, the critical player in this story was a civil servant trying to do his job by correcting an error discovered in his agency's database. This sparked a diplomatic row that was ultimately resolved at the highest level by President Bush himself. For me, the episode began early in the morning on Sunday, July 27th. My phone rang. It was my BlackBerry cell, which meant a work call. Calls at this hour on a Sunday morning on that phone were generally not good news. My colleague from the South Korean embassy was on the other line. He was deeply concerned about, quote, the new US position on Dokdo. He referenced a BGN website and something about undesignated sovereignty. I have to admit I had no idea what he was talking about. I knew that Dokdo Takashima tensions between Korea and Japan were high that summer, due to Japan's reported plans to claim that the islets were part of its national territory in an educational guideline. But I did not know what BGN was. I was quite certain that the US had not altered our longstanding position of neutrality on this issue, and I had never heard the term undesignated sovereignty before. I got off the phone, headed to the office, and learned a couple of things. First, BGN, as many in this room likely know, stands for the Board on Geographic Names. It is a federal body administered by the Department of Interior and for certain functions, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, that aims to maintain uniform geographic name usage throughout the US federal government. Second, a civil servant at BGN had recently altered the Dokdo listing in its online database to say Liancourt Rocks / undesignated sovereignty. Previously, it had inaccurately listed Korea under the country column, seemingly indicating U.S. acknowledgement of Korea's sovereignty over the island. The further inaccuracy from the standpoint of the official U.S. position was the use of the term dokdo rather than the more neutral Liancourt rocks that the U.S. uses to refer to the islets. While I was unaware of the precise impetus for BGN's designation change, I suspected that this was an effort to correct a previous error in the agency's database to ensure its alignment with U.S. policy. I was certain it was not intended to signal a change in U.S. policy. After all, there are much more straightforward ways of doing that. It was clear that this was going to be a busier week than it was expected. My office, NSC's Office of Asian Affairs, was already up to our ears with preparations for the president's upcoming trip to Asia, which was to include stops in Seoul from August 5th to 6th, then Bangkok, and finally Beijing for the opening ceremony of the Olympics on August 8th. We were immediately concerned about the implications the U.S. injection into this dispute might have at this stage. After all, the president had postponed a previously scheduled visit to Seoul because of widespread protests over the ROK government's plans to resume imports of U.S. beef. We worried that the current situation might serve as a rallying cry for renewed anti-U.S. protests, never a good backdrop for a presidential visit. On Monday, I was greeted with a stack of reports from the Korean media blasting the, quote, new U.S. stance on Dokdo and Washington's, quote, pro-Japan bias. It was apparent from these reports, a few of which are cited in my paper, that the South Korean media had already determined its own explanation for BGN's change on the basis of two false assumptions. The first false assumption was that the U.S. chose this moment, in the heat of Japan-ROK tension on this issue, to alter its stance on Dokdo. The second false assumption was that through choosing a, quote, new neutral path, the U.S. was revealing that its true sympathies lie with Japan. Seeing these reports, it was clear to us that the U.S. government needed to get on the record quickly to correct these misperceptions. State Department Acting Deputy Spokesman Gonzalo Gallegos had the first opportunity to do so at the State Department daily press briefing that day. I won't read the entire transcript here, it is provided in my paper, but he did make clear that, quote, the U.S. position for decades has been not to take a position regarding the sovereignty of the islands in question. We'd welcome any outcome agreed to by both Korea and Japan, end quote. This statement and others like it in the following days were cited broadly in ROK newspaper reports, but unfortunately, it did not do much to quell the underlying spin that there must be more to this story than meets the eye, that the U.S. must be hiding some underlying desire to side with Japan. The media buzz continued on Tuesday. The buzz put more pressure not on us, but on our friends in the South Korean embassy in Washington. Ambassador Lee Tae-shik was accused of, quote, negligence of duty for not blocking BGN's change. Foreign Minister Yoon Myung-hwan reportedly ordered the ROK embassy to, quote, deliver our concern to the United States. Ambassador Lee, being the extremely energetic and dutiful representative of his country that he was, did not take this order lightly. In a move that took considerable resolve, he delivered Seoul's concern directly to President Bush at an unrelated event that Tuesday afternoon. On a side note, for those of you who have worked on the staff of the NSC or elsewhere in the foreign policy apparatus of the U.S. government, you know how much time and effort goes into pull-asides with the president. Even given weeks of advanced planning, they are very hard to orchestrate. Pulling off an unscheduled pull-aside to lobby on a particular issue at an unrelated event is near impossible. But that was Ambassador Lee for you. An extremely determined individual, nothing got in his way when he was under orders from his capital. President Bush had high regard for Ambassador Lee, and of course, the president he served, Lee Myung-bak. In response to Ambassador Lee's request, President Bush immediately directed Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to look into the designation change and determine exactly what took place. The State Department was already energized, working closely with my office at the NSC in looking into the situation. My paper mentions the normal processes that would have been employed to assess the situation and consider next steps. When the president gets involved on something of a time-sensitive nature, however, the usual processes are streamlined. In this case, most of the gathering of information and consideration of options occurred in a series of phone calls between my office at the NSC and the Korea desk at State. As for next steps, we essentially considered 3 options. Briefly, these were: 1, we could eliminate access to, i.e. take down the BGN website. 2, we could leave the website as it was following the BGN corrections, i.e. with the Dokdo Korea entry changed to Liancourt Rock's undesignated sovereignty. Or 3, we could reverse the BGN change, i.e. revert to the status quo ante, while continuing preparations for a complete website overhaul in the future. In my paper, I discussed the pros and cons of each option. The key point was that none of the 3 options were perfect. 2 had considerable downsides, and 1 needed to be ruled out altogether. On Wednesday, our deliberations on next steps were truncated. The National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley, had briefed President Bush on our progress and the options we developed. The president, being the decisive leader that he was, wanted to take immediate action to defuse the situation and to calm the speculation in the South Korean press. President Bush did not want the BGN issue to distract the attention of the South Korean government from the key strategic issues on the table for discussion during his upcoming visit. As you probably recall, these included the North Korea nuclear issue, the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, the realignment of U.S. forces on the peninsula, and the overall strengthening and expansion of the U.S.-ROK alliance. The president perceived that this situation was creating real difficulties for a friend and ally, and the immediate cause of the problem lay in Washington, not Seoul. And so, the president chose option 3, reverting to the status quo ante. The president's decision was officially announced on Wednesday, July 30th, during a press conference on the president's upcoming trip to Asia. This decision removed the near-term issues from our desks, but longer-term issues remained unresolved. It was clear that there were both technical and procedural problems that needed to be addressed with respect to BGN's operations in making changes to its database on matters of potential diplomatic sensitivity. I don't have time to go into the recommendations for technical and procedural changes we generated with the State Department, but I outlined these briefly in my paper. To wrap up, as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, this story is not one of high drama and intrigue. It is the story of a civil servant who was trying to do his job. In this case, that had some fairly significant consequences. Historians, perhaps some in this room, will ultimately judge how the process was managed and whether the right decisions were made. From where I sat, and with the benefit of hindsight, I believe that those involved at the NSC, State, and BGN did well under the circumstances and given the options available at the time. The president's ultimate decision could be criticized for reconstituting an error. However, I believe his reasoning was sound. Top among his aims were: 1, ensuring that the strategic agenda with the ROK remained on track, and that the South Korean government was not needlessly distracted from these issues while the BGN issue remained tense. And 2, alleviating the obvious difficulty this was causing his friend Lee Myung-bak. I was not able to read the president's mind, but I imagine that he viewed living with an inaccurate database in the near term as a small price to pay for achieving these objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating account. Now I'd like to invite Professor John Van Dyke to discuss this.
Thank you, Judge Peck. It's a great honor to be on this panel and at this important meeting. And I've certainly learned a lot already today. And I have the honor of being a discussant. I want to go through some of the disputes that have been put out on the table both this morning and this afternoon, and offer some comments and thoughts on them. And I'm going to move from south to north on these matters, starting with the South China Sea, which we talked about a bit this morning. And on these slides, you see the 9 dashes that appear on many Chinese maps. People usually trace this back to about 1947 with a map put forward by what was then the Republic of China. Here's a Vietnamese version of it showing it. And this is one of the earlier versions. And apparently, it purports to be a claim of the entire South China Sea by China, although China has never explained exactly what it is that they claim, nor the basis for that claim. And it has led to a lot of awkwardnesses over the years, including the impeccable incident in March of 2009 south of Hainan. So this sort of remains as a mystery, but as a festering one. And the other countries of the region, of course, also make claims, and so we have a very complicated patchwork of claims. It's very difficult to draw a very clean map of this, but on this map you see the different features that are in this Spratly group of islands, the Nansha Islands. There are about 25 to 30 of these features that are above water at high tide. Most of them are very, very small, and they're claimed, many of them, by Vietnam and by the Philippines, by Malaysia, by Taiwan, and by the People's Republic of China. We're sort of at a stalemate. We've been at this stalemate now for many decades about exactly how to address and resolve these matters. This map here shows what I think should be the ultimate maritime delimitation of the South China Sea, which would involve ignoring completely the Spratly Islands in terms of the delimitation, because they are rocks under Article 121.3 of the Law of the Sea Convention. They're uninhabitable. They can't sustain any economic life of their own. I would give the Paracel Islands, the Xisha Islands, a role in the maritime delimitation. That would, as you see in this map, give China a fair chunk of the South China Sea up in the north area, but many people think the hydrocarbons are more likely to be in the southern part of the South China Sea, so that never seems to be sufficient for China. The features are really quite small. You see in these slides some of the assignments given to military guards by the various claimant countries on these rather modest features. This is the largest, Itu Aba, which is controlled by Taiwan at the present time. This is the second biggest, the Pagasa or Titu Island, now controlled by the Philippines. Here you see a distinguished Filipino leader going out to one of these features to claim Philippine sovereignty over it. Malaysia has tried to develop a couple of its features as scuba diving, snorkeling resorts. But these are too small to play a logical role in the delimitation, and for that reason they should be ignored. If you ignore them, it does leave an area in the middle of the South China Sea that's beyond the 200 nautical mile zones of any country, and you see it in this map, there are then continental shelf claims that might be made, so that although the exclusive economic zone can only go to 200 nautical miles, the continental shelf in some situations can be claimed beyond 200 nautical miles. And that is being done to some extent by some of the other countries now. The Philippines has adjusted their archipelagic claim in a interesting and unusual way to extend the archipelagic lines from their main islands out to the islands in the Spratlys that they claim, producing this interesting configuration. China immediately protested that within hours after the Philippine claim was made, and said, as they always say, that the People's Republic of China has indisputable sovereignty over these islands and their adjacent waters, whatever that means. Malaysia and Vietnam did an interesting thing by putting forward a joint claim to the extended continental shelf in this area in the middle that is beyond the 200 nautical miles. And Vietnam has also, by the way, protested against the name South China Sea, just as Korea protests against Sea of Japan. Vietnam protests against South China Sea, and interestingly, both Vietnam and Korea want to use the name EC for the body of water that they don't like the name of. So we have a kind of a problem. Maybe we need Northeast Sea or Southeast Sea or something, but we need some more imagination with names, I think. Anyway, China immediately protested the Vietnamese Malaysian claim, again within hours, and in doing so, they attached the 9 dashes as a very official document. So they are standing behind and relying on this 9 dashes. In March of 2010, U.S. officials said that they were told by China that the South China Sea was part of China's core interest of sovereignty, along with Taiwan and Tibet. And this seemed like it was a new kind of a statement. And then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, in July of this year, responded at the ASEAN Regional Forum meeting in Hanoi that the United States has a national interest in the freedom of navigation, open access to Asia's maritime commons, and respect for international law in the South China Sea. So we're going back and forth with statements and claims, and Secretary Clinton said that the United States supports a collaborative diplomatic process to resolve this matter without coercion, and we oppose the use or threat of force by any claimant. The Chinese foreign minister responded quickly once again, noted that 12 of the 27 countries at the ASEAN Regional Forum had supported Secretary Clinton's statement and suggested maybe there was some kind of orchestration going on, and described Secretary Clinton's activities as virtually an attack on China, very vigorously protesting what was characterized as the internationalization or multilateralization of this conflict, and saying that that Asians are fully capable of resolving this matter in the Asian way without U.S. intervention. And the spokesperson for the People's Liberation Army said, again, China has indisputable sovereignty of the South China Sea, and then quickly adds, though, that we will, in accordance with the demands of international law, respect the freedom of passage of ships or aircraft from relevant countries. So we're still sort of not clear what the Chinese claim is or the basis of it. And then, as people said this morning, China then just a few days ago planted a flag in the South China Sea at a great depth, 12,330 feet, apparently to let us know that they were serious about about this claim. We have a problem, and this is going to be a very difficult one to resolve because China's position is seems to be so inflexible, and even though China refers to international law, China seems to ignore Article 121, Paragraph 3, which Myra Nordquist was telling us about, which does say that certain types of island features, namely rocks that cannot support human habitation or an economic life of their own, do not qualify to generate exclusive economic zones. And so that's why, in my judgment, we have to ignore these Spratly, Nansha Islands and when we draw those maritime delimitation lines. Okay, then moving up the Asian coast, and Professor Wang's going to talk about this more, but the Diaodao Shenkaku dispute, of course, is still an ongoing one, and these are some very small islands located in the East China Sea on the edge of the continental shelf there. They have never been inhabited, 5 small islands with a total land area of 7 square miles. In this case, it's my understanding that China's position is that these islands should not affect the maritime delimitation, whereas Japan takes the position that they should, and Japan currently occupies these islands, although China very vigorously claims them. And just recently, as most of you know, there was an incident where a Chinese vessel, according to the Japanese press, rammed a Japanese Coast Guard vessel, and the Japanese arrested the crew and the captain, and they have released the crew, but the captain is still in custody. And it's interesting that the Japanese perspective on the Shenkaku Diaodao is sort of like, I guess, the Chinese perspective on the Spratlys and the Korean perspective on Dokdo, that we don't really even have a dispute, that there's just no question. Japan says there's no question, but that the Shenkakus are Japanese, and therefore there's nothing to talk about. Anyway, some activists from Taiwan went out to reassert their claim on this boat. Doesn't look too seaworthy to me, but in any event, they went out, and here's some of the crew being let free by Japan just a couple days ago. And interesting, the former U.S. Secretary of State, Richard Armitage, referred to this incident as a testing, with China testing Japan, and linked it back to the South China Sea and said that the incident perhaps is also China warning Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Taiwan with regard to its claim to the Spratlys in the South China Sea. So that there's a lot going on here. This is the statement by Ji Guok Sing, one of the leading Chinese scholars, where he says the Shenkaku Diaodao should not affect the exclusive economic zone because they're uninhabited and cannot sustain economic life of their own, and thus don't qualify under Article 121.3. Okay, well, the boundary between North and South Korea is also a contentious one, very much in dispute. And we've talked earlier today about the Cheonan incident, which happened in the west part of this yellow line. The yellow line is the northern limit line, which was drawn in 1953 by General Mark Clark for the purpose of discouraging South Korean vessels from going above that, and thus serving as a kind of a demilitarized zone to help bring the violence to an end. So we have the Cheonan being sunk with 46 sailors killed, and that inevitably raises the question, well, what is the legitimacy of this line? There are these 5 small South Korean islands up against the coast of North Korea, so that North Korea is sort of trapped within this line. And North Korea has argued that those 5 islands should be ignored in the delimitation, and that the delimitation should be the line that would be the equidistant line between the South Korean coast and the North Korean coast. As you see here, others have suggested maybe fingers coming out through the islands, but in any event, some attention is needed on this line to make some adjustments so that it would be equitable in the future. Okay, I'm running out of time, and we've talked about Dak To in some detail. So just to make one final point, I want to just say a word about the decision that took place in the Black Sea last year between Ukraine and Romania over this small island, which is called Serpent Island. And Serpent Island is a Ukrainian island, and it's located where that blue circle is there. And Ukraine said, well, the line, the maritime boundary between Romania and Ukraine has to be that green line because you've got to take Serpent Island into consideration. And Romania said, no, no, it's too small, it's too insignificant, nobody's ever lived there. So it's the red line that should be the boundary between Romania and Ukraine. And during the course of so the International Court of Justice ruled in favor of Romania and did, in fact, ignore the island in drawing the delimitation. So we have a very recent and very important decision that helps us as we look at these problems in Asia. And during the argument, Vaughan Lowe, who's a distinguished scholar at Oxford and has written the main book on the law of the sea, he was representing Romania, and he was asked, you know, well, what is a rock? And he says, well, what is human habitation? He says, human habitation means you are there because you want to be there. If your government orders you to be there because of military duty or scientific study, that is not habitation. The communities have to be stable and sustained. So this is a pretty important statement made by this distinguished scholar, and even more important, the International Court of Justice agreed and did ignore the island completely in the way they drew the line. Here's Serpent Island and Dak To. They're virtually the same size. So if Serpent Island is to be ignored, then Dak To should be ignored as well. And here's Ituaba and Pagasa in the Spratlys. They're a little bit larger, but they're not much larger than Serpent Island. So again, they should be ignored. I'm going to close at this point. So we'll have some time for questions. But the ultimate question, of course, is what should happen? How to resolve this? And I hope we have some time for discussion because, you know, should the sort of just do nothing and hang on to the islands you control? Should that be the right approach? Or should there be some conciliation process, as Professor Norkey suggested, whereby you try to promote some understanding, maybe some package deal where you're engaging in some quid pro quo so that there's some win-win situation? Anyway, these are the questions that are before the countries of East Asia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. We have only about 10 minutes. I'm sorry. Please be brief with your question or comments, please. I don't know who was first. Yes, yes.
Hi, thank you. Is this on? Okay, hi. Ife Zhang from Georgetown University. I I guess one specific question about the last presentation. The last comment made was about ordered to be there, right, by governments. But I think in the case of probably Senkaku, Diaoyutai, and with Dokdo, there's probably tons of fanatics who don't have to be ordered by their governments, who are willing to, you know, lead civilian efforts to just go there on their own and set up, you know, food assistance and, you know, build their own little houses there. How do you take into consideration issues about sort of that kind of civilian fanaticism? And secondly, just a general sort of comment about UNCLOS, you know, the convention. Is it more trouble than it's worth? Because it seems to be creating a precedent for all these different kinds of disputes and evaluations. Is there any kind of idea to reevaluate or create something new? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. I have questions for all of the panelists. The question is, how do you think about the legal effect of the claimants of the South China Sea, especially the little states of the South China Sea? They recognize China's sovereignty over all the islands in the South China Sea before 1970s. What is the legal effects of this recognition? Second, just now Professor Van Dyke said Japan occupied the Dewey Island, but in fact the islands are inhabited. If nobody is there, how do you think it is occupied? This is one question. And regarding also for this question, also for John Van Dyke, and you mentioned that the Chinese position is that the Dewey Island has no effect. It means zero effect in the maritime delimitation in the East China Sea. But I have never seen any official documents mentioning this. And maybe it is only about some scholarly opinion. And I have a question, and maybe a phone call to Catherine. What is the U.S. position on the Dewey Islands, especially when the U.S. hand over the islands to Japan in 1970s? Thank you.
Thank you. Larry first, and then gentleman next to.
This is principally to Dr. Lee. Japanese government, and I forget who exactly it was, it might have been Foreign Minister Okada, recently made a statement about Japan's colonial rule over Korea, which certainly seemed to be an apology. He specifically mentioned Japanese rule over Korea in that statement. Does that kind of a statement open up some greater possibility now that Japan and Korea might begin to negotiate, or to have at least a more direct exchange about Toto, in terms of looking at resolving that issue and perhaps some of these other maritime issues between them, including, by the way, the nomenclature issue, Sea of Japan versus East Sea, which, by the way, rankles the Japanese, and I have heard it from them. They take a pretty strong attitude that this body of water, geographically, really is more designated by the Japanese archipelago than by the Korean Peninsula. But is there an opening here, given what the Japanese government has just done within the last month or so?
Yes, please, gentleman behind Larry.
Will Amatruda, the principle has been mentioned of sustainability, and desalinization of seawater certainly introduces historically unknown factor. The specific case that prompts my question is Parim Island in the Bab el-Mandeb, in the strait between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. In 1857, the British occupied it and built a lighthouse there, and very quickly discovered there was no water, and abandoned it. And I don't know who is recognized as having legal sovereignty there now.
Okay, we have 2 more questions. Please be brief. First here, and then first.
My
yes,
question
yes,
is very
please.
simple, because I didn't quite get what Professor Van Dyke said. Is the northern limit line legally compatible with the law of the sea? Period. Question mark.
Yes, last question.
Yeah, I'm Youngi Kim Reno, George Washington University. I was actually inadvertently involved in the very early stage of the BGN controversy. Actually, you probably meant to talk about it, but an important missing link there was it all started in the Library of Congress. Someone said, I mean, our cataloger suggested, because actually normally it starts with a cataloger discovering from a statistical work that another word is used more commonly, but this was not the case. It was at the suggestion of a letter sent to the Library of Congress, and then it was suggested, and it happened to be a Japanese American who told a Korean librarian in Canada who said this was going on, and she asked for my help because I was in Washington, and someone said I was a professor in Korean studies and so forth, so I got actually really embroiled in the controversy without really meaning to. And the thing was, the Library of Congress, when the Korean journalists got all excited about it, they said that the only thing they really have to rely on is what BGN says. But at that time, BGN, if they changed this record at other times, it would have been a different matter. But in this whirlwind of controversy, they just deleted the line. And usually in this computer age, if there is any change, there is a date marked. So I called actually the Randall Flynn, and I asked why there was no explanation. It suddenly disappeared, and I demanded they at least put an explanation on their web page. And he promised it never came. Instead, just reverting came. So I think it should be included in your revised paper or something.
Thank you. I'll give speakers a chance to respond, but bear in mind that we have only 1 minute. You may answer like yes or no if you can. Otherwise, you can say, I'll think about it. All right.
Well, the only major comment is in response to, is a convention worth it? 121.3 is one of 1,000 paragraphs in the 1982 Convention on the Law of the Sea. And at least they're arguing about what rule of law applies. So my response is yes, the convention is worth the trouble.
As to Dr. Nishi's, the comments on the Japanese apology for the past history, I think there is some progress in Japan, but problem is that once they made the apology, and that the follow measures do not fully follow. Now, as you see that when they made the apology to the Korean government or Korean people as to the past behavior based on the colonialism, but as you see that the last week, the white paper of the Defense Ministry of the Japan to repeatedly mention that the doctor issues. And the issue of the apology, I don't think this is the issue in the case of a doctor, because that apology to the Korean people do not accompany with the sincerity of the Japanese government. So as far as I understand, as you know, the couple of the historical textbook issues or the government official report on doctor issues cause seriously the doubt on the sincerity of the Japanese apology. So simple repetition of the apology, I don't think it makes the Korean people to understand. They are right now, they really want apology for the past behavior against Korea. So that's my understanding. Yeah.
I think I'm going to leave the early questions to the legal experts to answer, but I believe there were two directed at me. The first, were you referring to the Senkaku? So my understanding that the U.S. avoids publicly taking a position on that issue. Surprise, surprise. We, as historians here know well, the island was not mentioned specifically in the San Francisco Peace Treaty. However, it did fall within the purview of the islands that the U.S. took control of, as you all know, prior to 1972. So after 1972, my understanding is that we avoid taking an open position on the matter, but if pressed, we acknowledge that Japan does administer the island right now and that it falls within the purview of the Mutual Security Treaty. So I'm not an official at that time, so I don't have any problem saying that, but that is my understanding of our position on that issue. As far as your very helpful actual information on the LOC, I do have a long, probably too long paper that mentions a few of the details that you provided. But I wish I had access to you during that time, because I actually spent quite a lot of time trying to figure out what led to the change. It all happened, in far reaches of the government, and unfortunately, one of the points I also make in my paper, you don't always know what's going on everywhere, much to my dismay at the time. But your information was exactly what we were looking for. What led to the change? What calls were made? I did actually learn of the link between LOC and BGN. I heard a couple of different stories in terms of who contacted LOC, and of course people were interested. Was it the Japanese? For our purposes, it wasn't so important to identify exactly who made the calls when, but to make sure that there was no, policy guidance to BGN from within the U.S. government, and that was the key for us in determining what actually happened. The main point in my presentation was that it was a technical change. If it were something that were directed from, say, the White House or the State Department or Department of Defense, it would have been considered a policy change. And so those were the delineations we were trying to make at the time, and of course that sort of information was very useful, and it took us a little while to put together on Monday morning. So I hope that helps to answer your question. I think you had, on the explanation issue on the website, that I also go into that in the paper. We agree that the website needs some explanations because even though it is a fairly technical website, I think largely used within the U.S. government, obviously it's publicly accessible. And so absent those types of explanations, and when these changes take place, I think it can create a great deal of confusion, as was the case in the episode I described. So I fully agree with you, and my understanding is that those changes are underway, that there were some technical difficulties in terms of doing them quickly, but BGN has undergone a very significant website overhaul in recent years, and they're working towards that goal, is my understanding. So.
Okay, very quick answers to the 4 questions that were more or less directed at me, and I apologize for having to go through a lot of this complicated material very quickly. But in my professional opinion, the northern limit line is not compatible with the rules governing maritime delimitation. It is essentially an equidistant or median line between the North Korean coast and these 5 small South Korean islands. And in every maritime delimitation, islands get reduced effect. They don't get the full power to push back against a continental border, so that they would typically be enclaved with a territorial sea enclave around those islands, or you'd make some adjustment because of the small size of those islands. It violates the principle of non-encroachment, which says you're not supposed to smother a coast, the principle of maximum reach, which says you're supposed to be able to more or less get out into the open ocean. With regard to Dr. Wang's question about China's position on the Senkakus, Dr. Jigwak Singh has been very clear that China does not claim an exclusive economic zone or continental shelf from those islands. I suppose you're right that there's been no official position by the Chinese government. The Chinese government seems reluctant to give us official positions on quite a few issues. But China has been very clear in challenging the claim around Okino Torishima, which is another tiny island that Japan claims in the Western Pacific. And so China is on record saying that there are certain features that are too small to generate exclusive economic zones and are thereby rocks. And I think the Diaodao Senkakus certainly fall into that category. Then a question about, well, there would be civilian fanatics who would be happy to live on Dokdo, so doesn't that make it habitable? Well, there's no water source. There's no fresh water source on Dokdo or on the Senkaku Diaodao. And so I think that is probably a pretty irreducible minimum, that there has to be a fresh water source in the feature that we're talking about. The Law of the Sea Convention is very clear that artificial islands do not generate zones, and so they want to discourage countries from adapting features for the purpose of getting these zones, which Myron Nordquist reminded us that the zone is as big as the state of California once you get it, so a lot's at stake here. Von Lowe, when he was arguing this for Romania before the International Court of Justice, said that Serpent Island was no different than a steel platform because it produces nothing of itself. It offers nothing to human beings why they would want to live there. And if it's just a steel platform and if you bring out all the supplies, then it's basically an artificial island. So the spirit, as well as the language of the Law of the Sea Convention, I think leads to the conclusion that a feature without a water source should not be able to generate an extended continental shelf or an exclusive economic zone. And then finally, with Dr. Wang says everybody recognized China's claim to the Spratlys prior to 1917. I don't believe that's historically accurate. And my own studies of this indicate that China's claim has certain strengths and certain weaknesses, just as Vietnam's and the Philippines and Malaysia, they all have some strengths and some weaknesses. You can't be clear as to any clear ownership over the Spratlys. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's better just to ignore them, because you're never going to resolve completely who owns them, and they're too small to be relevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This will conclude the session 2. I thank once again 5 panelists for their contribution, and I thank you all. Thank you.